This idea of the quantum tunneling, which is a very strange idea, right? It's basically this idea that, let's say you are a person who's going from one room to the other, and there's a door in between. So you basically open the door and you walk out. But what if I were to tell you that you don't have to open the door, right? And you appear on the other side. It's almost like it is a tunnel that has been created, and it can appear on the other side with some finite probability and of occurrence, right? Now, that cannot be explained if the particle is a structure. It's like a particle as such, right? But it can be explained if it is a wave, essentially. The wave-like tendency can accommodate for that thought, right? And the last aspect which I want to kind of highlight here is that of the most strange part of quantum mechanics, one could say, one of the most strange parts is that of quantum entanglement, right? This idea that things, or rather the properties of particles can remain connected, right? Even if you were to take them spatially apart to very, very different places, right? Far off distances. And there is a certain correlation that exists. And this correlation is also used for many applications.
Namaste viewers, welcome to Sangam Talks. Today we will start a new series, and this is very close to my heart, and of course today we have with us Mrittunjoy Guha Majumdar, Dr. Mrittunjoy Guha Majumdar, and I have the privilege to address him as my brother, Dada. So Mrittunjoy Da, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So Mrittunjoy Da, Dr. Mrittunjoy Guha Majumdar is a quantum physicist and wears many feathers in his caps. Before we start, let me introduce about that episode and the series also. It's about physics, and not only physics, physics in parallel with Indian Vedantic thoughts, Upanishadic beliefs, philosophy. When we talk about physics, it is universally regarded as a subject of profound importance and intrigue. It's, I can't help myself to introduce myself also as a student of physics, and I find it that this subject is to understand how the universe functions. Physics in many ways serves as a gateway of unlocking mysteries of the cosmos, and the sense it offers a foundation for students to explore the very fabric of reality. Today, however, physics becomes very advanced, and it reached such an advanced level that it almost become a esoteric subject for general public. So that's why we have with us a quantum physicist himself, Dr. Mrittunjoy Guha Majumdar. Currently he holds a position of adjunct professor from National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bengaluru, and assistant professor from Amrita Vishwavidyapitham, Delhi NCR. Well, let me tell something about his education and research trainings, and he is a doctorate from Cavendish Laboratory, and he had his postdoctoral researches from prestigious institutes like Harvard. Academic achievements like Trinity Barlow Scholarship, Nehru Scholarship, and TIFA NIUS Fellowship. He was a lead speaker in the National Quantum Mission NQM Strategic Consultation Meeting. He had his training in artificial intelligence from MIT Schwarzman School of Computing. He also has experience working with the Ministry of Human Research Development, UNESCO, and G20 on education and science policy. He also have experience to done a documentary on quantum mechanics aired on Doordarshan, and we found his profound knowledge in quantum mechanics, and also he also endeavored in the path of Trikasaivism, like Indian philosophies like Trikasaivism, and all of these elements we found in his latest highly acclaimed book, which is called Shiva to Schrödinger. Lastly, he also holds a position as a national convener of Mandala, an initiative bridging contemporary science and Indic thought. So I will start with my question. Firstly, physics become a very esoteric subject nowadays, and also First we will, in this episode, let's talk about the quantum realm. So my first question to you, sir, people often talk of the treatment of physics in Indian knowledge system, IKS, either at a metaphysical level or at the level of classical physics. Is that true, or if not, then why has the narrative been propagated for so long?
Thank you, Devashish, for that very kind introduction. So the pursuit of truth has been the cornerstone, the premise of the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara. And the idea that ours was just a metaphysical or a philosophical perspective only doesn't quite do justice to the many other strands of thought. So physicalism was actually very much a part of our Indian knowledge systems, the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara. We get references to Twastri, who is a deity who's looked at as the architect, as the creator of forms, of shapes, even said to be the deity who formed Vajra, which is Vedic deity. Vajra is Indra Dev's weapon, essentially. And later on in later texts, he is also identified with Vishwakarma. We know about Vishwakarma. We have Vishwakarma Puja. Then we have texts like the Surya Siddhanta, which talks about many aspects of time cycles, celestial movements, and calculations, mathematical calculations as well. We wouldn't go so far as to say that Gurutvakarshana or the gravitation, in the sense of Newtonian gravitation, whether that was there or not, is a matter of debate, of course. But there were certain tendencies of bodies, let's say, which were there in the celestial realm that was addressed as well. And so then we come to Nyaya Vaisheshik, right? Nyaya Vaisheshik talks about many different categories of ontology and epistemology. Maharishi Kanad's oft-cited atomistic theory, right? As well as references to things like magnetism, electricity, and fluid dynamics as well, is also found in Vaisheshik Sutra, for instance. So all in all, there were a lot of different elements which were physicalist in their own ways. So a modern scientist would ask that whether this was something only relating to classical physics, right? And so my answer to that would be probably not, right? Because if you ask me the question that whether quantum physics and standard model was found or not, or was it formulated, I would say not in the way we have it in the modern context, the articulation and the conceptualization per se. But there were many elements of the metaphysics of the Indian knowledge systems which defies classicality in the modern scientific or metaphysical terms. So one of the key ideas was that of interconnectedness, right? The idea of connections across space and time. So in the Chandogya Upanishad, for instance, when we talk about the very well-known aphorism or the shloka, which is Sarvam Khalvidam Brahma, which talks about the connections across space and time, that is something which is basically, it is placed in the underlying reality of Brahman, right? Of the underlying reality of Brahman, which we talk about in Vedanta. And in the Chandogya Upanishad itself, we have certain other references as well. We have Maharishi Udalak Aruni, who has a conversation with his son Shwetaketu. And in that, he talks about this very interesting example, right? Where he's asking him that if you take a little bit of salt and you dissolve it into water, let's say, where is the salt, essentially, right? So the salt is not there in form per se, but there is an underlying essence of the saltness in the water itself. So that was a very metaphorical and metaphysical way to describe how there is an inherent unity, so to say, among various elements of nature as such. But we have to be a little careful here because as we will go along in the discussion, the idea of interconnectedness has to be qualified, right? At what realm is it being applied, in what way is it being applied, is something that we need to be a little careful about. On another front, we have the concept of dualities, right? Dualities and multiplicities of things. And in that, I think we have in quantum mechanics, we talk about the wave-particle duality. Where there are very different aspects of nature, of the elements that are out there, that are reconciled within the same reality, so to say. So for instance, you have the wave-like characteristic and the particle-like characteristic and so on and so forth. Now, in the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, Especially you mentioned about Trika Shaiva Darshan. There is a very well-known a luminary, who is I look up to and whose works are extremely multifaceted, very comprehensive in many ways in terms of the philosophy. Abhinav Gupta ji, right? He talks about the interplay of opposites, right? The way the opposites can be, working together, right, to create a certain reality, so to say. In the Devi Atharva Shirsham, which is a very well-known, religious, text essentially, or something that we use in prayers, so to say. There is this very famous shlok, right, which says, "Aham Brahma Swarupini, Mat Prakriti Purusha Jagatam, Shunyam Cha Shunyam Cha." Right? So the idea here is that I am of the form of Brahman, right? And Prakriti Purush are parts of that reality. Prakriti Purush being the dualistic elements. One is worldly, one is more principles oriented or spiritual in that sense. And in this reality itself, there is the void and not the void as well. Shunyam cha shunyam cha, right? So this idea of the reconciliation of something which is so different, which is like the two extremes of a spectrum, and being reconciled is something that has been spoken about in our Bharatiya Gyan Parampara. But again, as I say, as we go forward, I think we have to be very careful in terms of in what context were these applied, and not to kind of blindly join the dots, right? Because one of the things which the Western kind of the colonial project, right, was to kind of remove the multifacetedness, right?
And don't give them another weapon.
Exactly. So I always say that let us not try to seek validation from the Western context of our own traditions, right? Because they wanted to put us into a very categorized way of thinking, right? They had modern physics in the way, I wouldn't say modern, I would say physics before Einstein, let's say, right? Or roughly around that time. And they wanted to show us as some, we had some ideas, we had some concepts, but we did not have the scope and the range of ideas, of physical phenomena, which we could talk about, or even the metaphysics of it, right? So to answer your question, which you started off with, I think it was an intentional kind of approach of sorts, or probably it was not even intentional, it was probably because of their own ignorances and their own categorizations of how to understand nature, that they didn't quite go into that area, those areas of metaphysics, which now we see that modern physics is more resonant with, right? Things which are not classical in nature as such, are being seen in various texts and traditions. Yeah.
We have the examples like, greatest minds in the world of physics.
Absolutely.
They also talk in metaphors.
Right.
Like, and that's the way in Vedantic philosophy.
Absolutely.
That's the way they express things.
Right. In fact, the Gedanken experiments, right, and the way we kind of even talk about formalize or conceptualize things, even in that, I think there's a lot of element of not the empirical directly, but a representative form or a thought form essentially before we actually do the experiments, right? So Einstein, of course, had many Gedanken experiments that he went with, and it's very interesting that Einstein also at the very end he spoke about cosmic consciousness, which we'll come to hopefully during our discussions, which talks about how the laws of nature itself are a reflection or an expression of a much greater kind of metaphysics, you can call it, or a way of things, in the spirit. No, I wouldn't say spiritual is a wrong word, but a more transcendental manner of thinking, essentially. Obviously, he had many critics on that, as in many other things as well. But that's part and parcel of, any thinker's life and journey. Yeah.
If I may, Schrödinger himself, so-called father of quantum mechanics.
Absolutely. Yes,
he also mentioned Vedanta.
Yes, he did. And I think Werner Heisenberg, Schrödinger, they all kind of at some level spoke about it as well. Yeah.
So before I go to the second question, I will ask the viewers also look for the talk by Dr. Mrittunjoy on our channel about the Trikashaivism. There is a talk about him. I will put the link in the description. So Dr. Mrittunjoy, in the early part of 20th century, scientists found that physics of the smallest of systems was very different from the physics of things we see around us. So like classical mechanics and the quantum mechanics. What was the radically different in those two segments of this subject.
Absolutely. I think before I address that, I would like to highlight that, in our traditions, we always talk about the cessation of ego, right? The cessation of, actually in yoga, we talk about vritti nirodha, chitta vritti nirodha, right? Which is basically the perturbations in the consciousness. And oftentimes those perturbations comes out as, not the right kind of perturbations, basically. And in that tradition, we talk about the cessation of ego, right? Of narcissism. In the Western context, before this revolution that you spoke about, there was a certain level of smugness. There was a certain level of, feeling that we know everything that is out there. And there is a very well-known, quote. I wouldn't say shlok because it was just a quote, which talked about how the different parts of physics had already been found, essentially, or the theories thereof had been already discussed. It was just about application of that in different contexts. And within 10 years or so, this was roughly in the 1890s, you have the very well-known Annus Mirabilis, which is the year of miracles. This was the year when Albert Einstein published 4 different papers, and all the 4 papers were very seminal, very path-breaking in their own ways. So there was special relativity, which he spoke about. He spoke about the mass-energy equivalence. He spoke about photoelectric effect, which is what he got the Nobel Prize in physics for. And then he spoke about Brownian motion as well. Now, in the photoelectric effect, the idea was that there are certain ways in which if you were to impinge light, let's say, on a certain surface, let's say like a metallic surface, the way that energy from that light is translated into the matter and whatever is emitted from that matter, the way to think of it till, let's say, the 19th century was in terms of, often in terms of continuum, right? In terms of continuous energy, essentially. But that was later found to be not the case, right? In the photoelectric effect, for instance, there were just packets of energy, this idea of packets, right? So that is where the word quantum comes from, right? The word quantum is basically about packets, right? And variables coming in small units, essentially, right? So now in the early 20th century, there were a lot of different aspects which were very mind-boggling, right? For instance, things earlier in the classical domain, we knew about trajectories of particles or systems, right? If we roll a ball, let's say, right, and we have a certain initial, momentum or a velocity to it, we know by the mechanics laws, rules of mechanics, that it will move in a certain manner, right? Also, the idea that there are certain definite properties of things we see around us, right? So if I talk about the room around us or the table, essentially, the shape, the color, and so on and so forth will be determined. Now, that was not seen to be the case, right? So the first thing that was very different in the quantum domain was this idea of superposition, right? This idea of superposition, which means that there can be a multiplicity of possible states which the same system can have at a certain point in time, right? So there's often this example of a coin, right? A coin, if you twirl it, if you spin it, essentially, there are times when you will see the head and the tail at the same time as it is moving. That is not a very good example though, right? Because that is mainly because because of the motion, you cannot see which one it is at any point in time. In quantum mechanics, we are saying that before the point of measuring that system, you fundamentally cannot even know. It's not because your way of accessing it is wrong, right? Ontologically, at the level of reality itself, you cannot know which state it is in till you have the measurement for that particular system as such. So a very well-known example is that of the Schrodinger's cat experiment, right? Which is a very dramatic example where you have a room, let's say, and you have a cat and a radioactive particle, and that radioactive source or particle has a certain probability of being activated or not being activated. So now the poor cat, right, is left with that radioactive material and the room is closed, right? And so now the question that a friend can ask you is that, well, is the cat dead or alive, right? And of course, before actually opening the door, right, you do not know what it is, right? So as a classical thinking person, classical physicist, or thinking along the classical lines, you would say, I do not have sufficient information to say anything about it. Deterministically, I cannot say, right? I mean, there's an ambiguity of sorts. Whereas a quantum physicist would say that the cat is both dead and alive, right? Which is a very, very counterintuitive thing to say, right? How can a cat be both dead and alive, right? So that is exactly what the quantum theorists or the quantum physics world is trying to talk about, right? Then there is this idea of the wave-particle duality, right? Which I had come to. Now, we know that in classical physics, right, we have this the phenomena with light, right? There's a very well-known experiment by the name of the Young's double slit experiment, which is basically that you have two slits, right, and you let light pass through them, and then you have a screen at some distance off, and what you see on the screen is basically a pattern of dark and bright streaks, right, streaks of dark and bright streaks. And so that is because there is a wave-like tendency of the light, right? Now, in the early part of the 20th century, there was a discussion whether that is only true for light as such, or is there some way in which even matter has certain such tendencies, right? And that's a foundational thought or a concept in quantum physics. And it was seen that even when electrons, right, when electrons are allowed to get emitted, right, so you think of an electron as a particle, right, it's a certain particle. When it moves across, it will, your intuition will tell you, or you will think, right, that it will pass through one slit or the other, right? So now if I have, let's say, thousands of electrons one after the other going across, I will think that they will basically amass at in front of either one slit or the second slit, right? So there should be just two streaks, right? Streaks where it is hitting the screen. But what it comes out to be, right, when we have a number of different runs, is that it also replicates what the light had done, right, which is that the light and bright streaks, number of different bright and dark streaks, which means that on average, right, and in general, right, the electron also has certain tendencies which are wave-like, right? Because otherwise, if you think of it just as a particle, it wouldn't replicate that kind of a pattern as such, right? So it is a very, very counterintuitive thought that electrons also are waves, right? Or any particle is a wave as well. In my classes, sometimes students ask me whether we are waves as well. So, well, to an extent, I could say that there are some elements, right? But when we come towards what we call as a classical domain, right, the macroscopic world, the quantumness kind of gets suppressed because of various reasons, and it doesn't maintain that kind of tendency, right? But if you were to, let's say, have something like the Planck's constant changing to a very high value, let's say, then potentially this mediation of the wave and the particle nature could be more better translated into the macroscopic world, right? Then there is something called as the quantum tunneling, right? This idea of the quantum tunneling, which is a very strange idea, right? It's basically this idea that, let's say you are a person who's going from one room to the other, and there's a door in between. So you basically open the door and you walk out. But what if I were to tell you that you don't have to open the door, right? And you appear on the other side, right? Or to put a different example, which is often given, it's like a hill, right? A hill. So if there's a car that doesn't have sufficient energy to cross the hill, right? Classically, that would make perfect sense. It doesn't have that energy to do that. But in the quantum domain, there are times when this potential barrier, as it is called, that can be crossed, right, or tunneled through. It's almost like it is a tunnel that has been created, and it can appear on the other side with some finite probability and of occurrence, right? Now, that cannot be explained if the particle is a structure. It's like a particle as such, right? But it can be explained if it is a wave, essentially. The wave-like tendency can accommodate for that thought, right? And the last aspect which I want to kind of highlight here is that of the most strange part of quantum mechanics, one could say, one of the most strange parts is that of quantum entanglement, right? This idea that things, or rather the properties of particles can remain connected, right? Even if you were to take them spatially apart to very, very different places, right? Far off distances. And there is a certain correlation that exists. And this correlation is also used for many applications, right? Now, quantum mechanics, so for instance, when we talk about semiconductors, right, we talk about lasers, right? Now we have come to the realm of quantum computers, right? All of these relate to some or the other of these characteristics of the quantum world and how to optimize these processes, both in the physical sense as well as in technology and information theory. And so quantum mechanics has a very big role to play, right, when we're talking about all these various applications as such. Yeah.
So that's basically, if you, I mean, it needs actually at least an initiation to understand properly the difference between classical physics and quantum physics. So thank you, Mrittunjoy da. Dr. Mrittunjoy, my next question will be, how does the quantum mechanics mechanical view of what is real, compare with the conceptualization of reality from Indian Darshanas?
It's a very, very important question, I would say.
For
right?
you.
Yes, for me and for us all, I would say, right? Because I think this idea that our Gyan Parampara was not, equipped, that's a projection that is all often given as such. But I would say it was even more equipped than many of the, let's say, Aristotelian logic, for instance, or the Hellenistic thought, right? Which is often spoken of as a very, as a paragon, as an epitome, right? Now, when we talk about Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, especially when we talk about Vedanta, right? So there is something known as Vyavaharika Sattva and Paramarthika Sattva, right? Which basically means the idea of something which is imminent, which is immediate, right? Which is visible to us as such, and something which is much more fundamental, right? So when we talk about quantum mechanics, right? We talk about things like, for instance, I was just talking about dualities, right? Superposition, many other aspects, thematically speaking, on those fronts. Now, when we do an experiment, right, oftentimes many of these things are not visible beyond a point. They are inferential. You infer them from different kinds of experiments. So there is a layer of reality that we see around us, right, which is more imminent, which is more immediate, right? So in the world around us, right, the macroscopic world, we don't often see the effects of the quantum side, right? We don't, it gets averaged out, or it gets suppressed, essentially, right? So one could think about something which is an imminent reality, right? Kind of a Vyavarika Sattva, right? And something which is more of a Paramarthika Sartha, which is basically to do with the idea that there's something more fundamental, right, which lies below that, essentially, right? So now when we talk about this transition, there are certain aspects which I would like to highlight here. One is that of the separateness of things, right? This idea that there are things which are separate to each other, they are localized in certain ways, and they are deterministic, right, in many ways, right? But when we talk about the quantum side of things, we see that, number one, even when we define a system, right, and an environment, there are certain kinds of correlations that can get developed between the system and the environment. And unless it's a closed system, as we call, or we have certain approximations, we have to think about that continuous correlating as well, right? Also, the idea of uncertainty and the probabilistic aspect, the idea that things have a certain probability associated with them, right? They're not deterministic in that sense. Now, even till date, when researchers found out these various elements in the experiments, they did not know how to interpret it, right? There were many schools of thought, I would say, right? I mean, they did know how to interpret it, but there was a certain redundancy of theorizing, right? So for instance, there are two schools of thought in quantum physics, which is basically called as psi-ontic and psi-epistemic, right? Now, I'll just highlight what this means. So psi is basically the wave function. Okay, so wave function is something which you can think of as a mathematical entity, right? Which the name suggests wave, right? But you can think of it as a wave, like a mathematical entity that represents the wave-like aspect of things, but physically that it doesn't have a meaning beyond a point, right? So what it has is there are certain superposition that is embedded in these wave functions. And this superposition has some values associated with it, right? We call it pre-multipliers for the states. And the modulus square of that is what we see as probabilities in the experiments in our laboratories, basically, right? Now, when this came about, this idea of the wave function, right? This idea of superposition, the idea of duality and so on, some people said that this wave function is just a mathematical entity, right? There is no reality to it, right? Some others said, well, there probably is a reality to it, right? There is something which is ontologically there, right? There's something present out there. So the psi-epistemic talks about when you use that only in the context of defining the properties, right? Psi-ontic means there is actually the reality of that thing, right? So when we talk about Bohmian mechanics, I mean, some of our viewers and you may be familiar, David Bohm's idea, he talks about something called as a pilot wave theory. Pilot wave theory, right? So the idea is that the wave is up like a pilot, right? Like in a plane we have pilots, and the particles are in the wave itself. It's like confined within the waves, right? And as the wave is moving in a certain way, the particles are also moving along, right? So there is a way in which this pilot wave theory comes about. And there, this wave is actually a wave, right? He considers that as something which has a certain ontic aspect to it, right? So that is a very interesting idea which comes forth, right? Then there is something called as a many worlds theory, right? Many worlds theory. So I was talking about this idea of probability, right? Chance, that let's say this table, or things around us, right? This table has the color brown, right? But in the quantum sense, I would say this table could have the color red, green, black, brown, and blue, till the point I measure it to be something, let's say brown, and then it remains as brown, right? Now this idea that a table, or anything for that matter, can have a multiplicity of states, right? That just doesn't make sense to a to our intuition, right? Because we don't see that, right? We don't see something which is a fuzzy, ball of colors, right? Now, but the thing is, in the many worlds theory, what we say is that there are a number of different worlds, right, which are moving in a certain way, and which originate from the point where a quantum event has taken place. What does it mean? The point where you measure something, right? You measure, let's say, the color of this table. At that point, there is a divergence into different worlds, right? And we just happen to move into one of the worlds, right, which has, let's say, the brown color, right? But at the same time, there are other worlds which exist still, but we don't have access to it because we have moved into the world which has the color brown, right? So the idea was that the timelines, the aspect of timelines, essentially, so there are so many aspects of this which comes into the picture. Now, in this, one important thing is probability, right? The idea of probability. Now, probability itself is a very interesting concept, right? Probability in the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, I always say, people ask, right, ki hamare yahan pe did we have probability, right? I would say yes, right? Because in our itihas, for instance, the one key incident which led to the Kurukshetra war, right, was the dice, the dice game, essentially, right? And in that, I mean, Shakuni, right? I mean, there is a story, very interesting story, that back in the day, I think Bhishma Pitama, right? He had attacked Gandhar, and so what happened was they lost the battle, and they were, I think, confined in a certain space. All the members of the Gandhar royal family, and they were given very little, minimal kind of food, minimal food, and they had all contributed to make Shakuni stay alive and well, essentially. And they say that with the bones of the ancestors of Shakuni, the father and others, he made those dice, right? The dice which had some magical properties to them, right? So it would only listen to him, basically, right? But if you were to think about it mathematically, right? If you were to think about it in terms of how chance may occur, one can talk about something called as a weighted or a biased dice, right? So something which has a certain tendency to assume some of the numbers, right? Even with coins, right? We often assume that coins have half and half probability of falling on the heads or the tail side. But that need not be the case, right? You can do certain experiments where you make one side have more advantage over the other, for instance, right? Weighted coins and so on and so forth, right? So the thing is, this idea that you can bias it in a certain way clearly tells us, right, that at a practical level there was some understanding of chance for sure, right? And even in our metaphysics, the metaphysics of our parampara, we see that in many different aspects, right? So the idea of probability as something physical, something objective, is seen in something called as frequentism, which shows what frequency something occurs in if you do multiple runs of the same event or experiment, right? Frequentism, right? And the other, which we talk about when we speak about Bayesian logic, is something which is more subjective, right? It has to have some elements of what has already occurred, right? So what has already occurred influences our definition right now of the probability as we define it currently, right? So this idea of frequentism and Bayesianism, right? This idea of objective and subjective, right, is something that probability deals with, right? And in the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, we have always this subject-object binary, right? In the talk as well that you mentioned about, and this idea of the dualism of sorts, this has always been spoken about very much so, right? So there are some aspects which I wanted to highlight in terms of the probabilities of one-shot events as well, right? One-shot events as in Bayesianism talks about those things that may have occurred or may not have occurred in a contextual way, right? This idea of contextuality, right, is something which in the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara is very important, right? We'll come to that, I'm sure, as we go along. And the last thing I want to mention here, which is very important, is the role of a witness, the role of the person doing an experiment or the apparatus for the experiment, that is something which is very, very important in quantum physics, right? Now, some people say consciousness comes in, right? That theory is not quite the case right as we speak today, right? Because there is more about decoherence, and you don't need a human kind of witness per se, right? However, in the case of our Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, when we talk about Sankhya, for instance, there is a very well-known shloka, Purushosti Bhoktri Bhavat, right? Which is basically talking about the enjoyer of a certain reality, right? The person who's partaking it in, who's witnessing it, right? So the primacy of this partaker or the witness essentially is very much highlighted, right? Which also comes in the West quantum realm. Please, yeah.
Double slit experiment.
Yes, yeah.
There is also that
Absolutely.
observation, the element of observation
Absolutely.
comes.
So for instance, in the double slit experiment, if you were to have an observer right next to the slit, right, then you don't get that pattern anymore. You will only have it confined to, let's say, that slit ke samne there will be one streak, let's say. Right?
Suddenly electrons start acting like a particle.
Like a particle, right? So your act of observation itself, right, defines the particle-like or the wave-like kind of aspect of things, yeah.
So, wow. Dr. Mrittunjoy, my next question about entanglement. So, entanglement and superposition, you already mentioned these two things, challenge classical notions, such as of separability and locality. Can Vedanta provide any deeper insights into this non-classical and non-local quantum theories?
Right. That's a very important question, and I think that's my center point of research as well, right? I mean, quantum entanglement is what, and hyper entanglement and so on and so forth. So entanglement, just for your viewers, I mean, I would say, let me just quickly define it. Basically, the idea that you have a certain correlation or connection of the property values of different elements, right? So for instance, if I were to have this table and another separate table, right? And there is a one-to-one correspondence between the tables as such, right? So if this is brown, that has to be brown. If this is black, that has to be black, and so on and so forth. And it remains in that superposition, right? All those possibilities coexist, right? Till the point you measure it, right? Now, how do you measure it? If, let's say, I take this to Nashik, right? Or to Kolkata, right? And I keep this in Delhi, right? And I measure the color of this, I observe it, then it will uniquely determine what the color of the other would be as well. At the same, determine. Yeah, it would uniquely tell you exactly what the color should be like, right? However, people often say that there is a misconception that means that we are violating relativity, right? Because relativity talks about the speed of light being the ultimate kind of threshold, so to say. Well, it does not quite violate relativity, because this thing that we are doing here, right? The information is transferring immediately, like without any delay, right? But the way we use that information, which is what we call as physically meaningful information, for that you need to have a way to communicate between the two terminals, right? And if you were to take the net of the net process, right, of the information transfer and the communication, that does not violate relativity, right? So that is the resolution of sorts, right? Now I will take a slightly...
I also heard that mentioning of Man ki gati.
Man ki gati, yes.
Many,
right.
you know,
I know. Man ki gati say, yes. I mean, there is always this aspect of man, when we talk about man, the idea of consciousness or information, right? So I would like to highlight here that even physics does not say that information cannot travel faster than light. Information can travel faster than light, right? But physically meaningful information, right, which can give ideas about the physics aspect of things, right, which relates to that more directly, does not violate relativity per se. So relativity is still safe at the level of physics, right? But information is not just physics, right? Information is in maths, information is in information theory, computation, for instance, and so on and so forth, right? Now, I would like to take a small detour of sorts, right? I mean, a little bit of a variance from what people speak about in popular science talks and so on and so forth when they connect Bharatiya Gyan Parampara and physics, quantum physics in general, right? So one thing about this idea of measurement, right? We say that when we measure something in the quantum domain, it goes from a state of superposition to a localized state, right? However, in Vedanta, right, or in Kashmiri Shaiva Darshan, for instance, where Pratyabhignya is this idea of recognition, self-recognition, we actually go the other way around, right? If you think about it, right? Because what we are doing here is we have a localized person, us, right? If we were to realize ourselves, right, our own reality, so to say, then we become part of a greater self, so to say, right? A greater with a capital S self, right? Which is what we talk about in Vedanta, right? If you realize you're Brahman, right, you're no longer an isolated entity. You're no longer an isolated person as such, right? You are part of a greater reality, right? So you see, there is a logical, what do you call, it's the logical contrast of sorts, right? In the quantum domain, you're talking about going from a state of superposition, of a multiplicity towards a localized bit, right? Whereas I like to see the Vedantin aspect as going from a state of localization towards a state of superposition, right? Towards the greater superposition, so to say, right?
Am I right if I call it the Vedaved philosophy?
In a way, you could. But so there's one beautiful story of Ma Durga, right? We, as Bengalis, she has a very special place for us. And with Ma Durga, there is a very well-known story of Rakta Bij, right? Rakta Bij, right? So Rakta Bij was a demon, right? He was a demon who was wreaking havoc, essentially. And so he had, I think, got a boon, which was basically that the word Rakta Bij basically means that his blood is a seed, right? So wherever his blood drops, right, that is where another Rakta Bij will come up, right? So it's almost like you're cloning something of sorts, and there is a multiplicity that you're creating, right? Every time there is, so it's very difficult to kill that being, because the moment you strike them, right, there will be another 10 or 100 Rakta Bij that will come, right?
Every seed.
Exactly. Every drop of blood will have a what do you call Rakta Bij, right? Now the thing is, what to do? Right? So then Ma Durga and the Adi Shakti Rupa, brought out Ma Kali, right? Ma Kali came from, the Adi Shakti reality of the universe. And she took it upon herself that every time he drops blood, she will, take it into herself. She will not allow it to drop per se, right? And then finally, when that went on for a while, Rakta Bij could not reproduce. Or
Metaphor is
right. Now the thing is, and then Ma Durga finished him off, right? Now this idea of, I'd like to look at it as samskaras, right? Samskar, when we talk about it, samskaras are actually not only culture. We talk about some sanskar, right? But sanskar also relates to tendencies, karmic tendencies, right? How we define things and how it kind of persists in the karmic way, right? And many a times what happens is our karmic tendencies tend to multiply, right? They tend to multiply in a certain way. And the role of spirituality in the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara is to stop that multiplication from happening, right? To liberate ourselves from this multiplicative cycle, essentially, right? And to go towards that oneness, right? Towards that final reality, so to say, right? So it's a beautiful story, right? It's a beautiful story to kind of, please go ahead.
I am just trying to say singularity.
Singularity, right? Yes, singularity. But ironically, that singularity also has all the potential states as part of it, right? That is where the duality principle comes in, right? When Abhinav Gupta, he talks about the interplay of opposites, he says that everything from existence and non-existence, right? All the different binaries exist in that one reality. Right? So it's a very beautiful thought, right? The second thing which I would like to highlight, because you talked about entanglement, entanglement is not quite what we talk about in Vedanta, and I'll tell you why, right? Vedanta talks about spiritual non-separability, right? Vedanta is talking about how we, at the very fundamental layer, are connected at the spiritual level, right? And in a way, our reality also co-defines, right, or is part of that greater reality, right? And we are interconnected in the true sense, right, as we call it. Now, in physics, what we are talking about is not quite connectedness in that sense, right? It is talking more about correlations of properties, right? How the properties are connected to each other, right? So I often hear in public fora, right, and in popular science talks, that entanglement means one particle is affecting the other particle. It's influencing the other particle. Not quite, right? Entanglement is prepared, it can be generated, and then when it is taken apart, there is a one-to-one correspondence of the property values, right? So if I do something here on this side, let's say, then it will not affect the other one. So there's something known as local operation. Local operation means I can do a local operation at one of the terminals. It will not affect the entanglement per se or the other particle, right? So that's a misconception, which I would like to kind of clarify here. So science is not talking about that level of interconnectedness. It's just talking about correlations, right? So when we have to be very careful when we talk about superposition, right? The idea of consciousness, the idea of entanglement, right? In both the realms, firstly, it's spiritual and empirical primarily. And in one case, it is the pura ulta, I would say, the pura contrary, the converse, essentially, as I see it. And in this case, I would say it is not quite talking about the same kind of interconnectedness, right? So we have to be very careful. Now, when we talk about entanglement, one other small point I would like to highlight. In Srimad Bhagavad Gita, right, we actually talk about the breaking of entanglements, right? Breaking of the worldly entanglements, right? Now, people often say that is it the same as the other one as well, right? Now, there is a very famous story which is given in Srimad Bhagavad Gita, or a symbolism or a metaphor basically, which is on the Ashwatha tree, right? Ashwatha tree, which is a very interesting tree. The tree is such that the roots are in the air and the shoots are below the ground. Upside down, right? Now, that is because it talks about how the fundamental reality, right, and the way we look into the, what do you call, the material manifestation, right, it is actually not as we perceive it to be, right? And in this process, he talks about how the worldly entanglements have to be removed, have to be minimized, essentially, right? So that is something where science does not go along those lines, of course, right? I mean, in terms of entanglement cessation, right? There's a slight paradox here, right? The paradox, as you rightly put it, it's a singularity that encompasses all the multiplicity. It has in it the multiplicity, right? Whereas in physics, we're talking about the entanglement being generated between system and environment as well, and increasing levels of entanglement in many different kinds of systems, so to say. Right? We are not quite talking about a singularity per se, right? In fact, we are talking about moving away from a singularity, right? For instance, the Big Bang, if you were to kind of go with that idea, is talking about how Lemaitre, there was Georges Lemaitre in 1927, I think he gave this idea, and Hubble and others worked on it, that there is a certain singularity, and from there we have things coming out. Penrose later on talked about cyclic cosmology model, that, you know, there is a Big Bang and there's a big crunch, right? It moves from the singularity, goes back, right? But we are still at the stage where we cannot prove that, right? Because it's still expanding, right? So science does not quite do what we are trying to do in Vedanta, for that matter. And I think that's why it's not all the way correct to kind of join the dots. So we have to be very nuanced in our perspective on superposition and entanglement. Yeah.
So, in layman terms, if I try to simplify this, can I say that is a controlled chain reaction, something like that? Like Bhagavan Krishna told Arjun that whatever you do, the end result is all the Kauravas will be killed in this field. The end is singular.
But in that, I'll tell you a very interesting story, which I'm sure, I mean, people are very well aware about. The Kauravas actually got to heaven.
Yes.
Right? They were, in fact, Yudhishthir had to go through purgatory, hell, whatever you want to call it. I don't like that word because it has a Western connotation. But he had to kind of pass through some trials, and then he got to heaven. Whereas when he went there, he said, "Are Duryodhana is sitting here." Right? I mean, he is definitely the antagonist, right? He's not the protagonist. So aisa kyun hai? Why is that, right? So the idea again goes back to this point that even Duryodhana, with his negative being, is part of that higher reality. He's still reconciled in that reality, right? In fact, Shivji, when we talk about Lord Shiva, there are many times, most of the demons you will see, right? The very prominent demons, right? Like, for instance, Ravan and Asura and the Rakshas, basically, they get their boons from Shivji, right? Always, right? And then there is Vishnuji who has to come by and, do something about it. So the idea is, why is it so? Right? I mean, one thing is you could say he's Bholenath, so he can, but it's not so, right? It is much more fundamental in that when we talk about Shivatva, right? This idea of Shivatva is much more fundamental, right? And it reconciles these binaries very naturally. So the binary of good or bad, right? Or in an absolute sense, is not quite distant from him. It's very much a part of him itself, of the Shivatva element, the principle itself, right? So when one looks at it in that way, right, things become much more broad, right? We don't talk about binaries anymore, right? Us versus them, right? This only is very contextually and circumstantially placed, is us versus them. But in the broader sense of things, right, we don't quite, dehumanize, for instance, or we don't remove the spiritual element from the other side as well, right? We talk about illusion, right? In Vedanta, we talk about Maya, right? The idea of the veil that covers, in certain ways, and we have to get through that veil to understand the Brahman consciousness, so to say.
Right. When there is chaos, there is Shivji, and when there is, perfect
Right.
singularity,
Right.
there is also Shivji.
Absolutely.
And in between also,
Yes, like Rudra Roop, right? Rudra Roop of Shivji. I mean, where the Tandav, for instance, is playing out in a certain way, and then you have the Shankar Roop, right? Which is more kind of the people call about domestic. Yeah, well, you call it householder Roop of Shivji, but both of them are part of Shivatva itself, Shivji itself. Yeah.
and Dr. Mrittunjoy, you already touch upon the probabilistic nature of physical reality, deterministic classical view on contrast with that. Quantum mechanics deals with such things. But how does things like Anumana, inference, in Indian epistemology, which deals with probabilistic reasoning and inference-based knowledge, help us understand the non-deterministic framework of quantum mechanics?
Right. That's a very, very important question, because we have touched upon probability, but we have not quite looked at the Indian knowledge system side of things. So there are many places where there's a deterministic angle to things. For instance, in Nyaya and Sankhya, for instance, there are parts where it's fairly well defined in its own way. But there are also aspects of logical and metaphysical uncertainties, or the gaps, so to say, in determinism, which exists in Nyaya itself as well as in things like Buddhist logic, so to say, right? So when we talk about, for instance, Nyaya, right, and we also talk about Buddhist logic as well, there is a thing called Vyapti. Right? Vyapti is basically the concomitance, as it is called, the connection between cause, effect, or in the context of arguments, right? The middle and the major terms in the argument are spoken about in terms of Vyapti, Hetu and Sadhya, as it is called, Sadhya, right? So, so that basically involves how do you infer things, right? How do you kind of make an argument, the concomitance happen, right? Now, the concomitance or the argument itself is deterministic. There is a specific way to kind of establish it. But the way to do that, right, is basically based on many different instances where that Vyapti, or the thing that you're trying to establish, has to be assessed, has to be looked at. You also have to look at counter examples of an argument that you're talking about, right? So, for instance, when you talk about Buddhist logic, there is something called as a Traya Rupya, right? Dignaga was a very well-known luminary, and Traya Rupya, Traya means three, Rupya basically, which talks about the three roops, or the clauses you could call it, or conditions you can call it, and it relates to Vyapti in a way, manner of speaking. So in that you talk about Anvaya Vyapti, right? Anvaya Vyapti, which is basically established concomitance, so to say, and then you also talk about Vyatireka Vyapti. Right? Vyatireka Vyapti, which is the counter example, so to say, right? And there are certain other, there's one other clause as well. Now, the thing is, the way we establish this, right, has to be over different, in physics terminology, you can call it as ensembles, right? Or different instances, right, of a certain kind of instantiation of a certain reality that is embodying a certain principle or statement we are trying to establish, right? Now, when we talk about Mimamsa, right, there is something known as Arthapatti. So Arthapatti is basically trying to look at how we assume something, right, before we try to prove it. Right? We have a certain assumption, so to say, right, as the reality of that assumption, we assume beforehand, right? Whereas in the quantum domain, right, there are many things which we don't talk about in terms of the reality aspect, right? Whether the reality of this table and its color, right, which we were discussing, how do we kind of reconcile that, right, is something where I would say there are differences, right? So Vyapti as well, there is a certain difference at the level of how you present it, but the way you get to it can have elements of probabilistic aspects, right? And in Arthapatti as well, you basically have a definition of the reality, which is not necessarily the case when we talk about the quantum logic or the quantum aspect of things, right? However, having said that, there are also things like the Madhyamaka school, right? The Madhyamaka school of Nagarjuna, where we do not have any reality in an absolute sense, right? There is no element, there's something called as shunya, which even in the Buddhist logic we talk about, which is that there is an underlying non-absolutism, right, to it. So there the idea of determinism, right, is itself irrelevant. It cannot even be applied for that matter, right? So there are some people who have worked on that, and then there is this concept of pratitya samutpada, which is basically dependent origination of things, which means there is a contextual or a relational way in which things evolve as they do, right? So there is a word, there's a phrase in English which is called relations sans relata, which means that what is being related is not as important as a relationship itself, right? So pratitya samutpada and the idea of shunyata is very, very important. Now, when we talk about Kashmiri Shaiva Darshan, right, this idea of Paramashiva, right, the idea of spanda, right, the spanda is this pulsation of consciousness, which is a reflection of Shivatva in a manner of speaking. Rather than a fixed structure, right, it has a certain contextual element to it. Right? It is a very beautiful way it is presented, and even in Vedanta, right? When we talk about this idea of Ajatavad, right? Ajatavad, and in the Mandukya Karika, there is a certain contextual way in which Maya and Brahman work as they do, and then that leads to the emergence of what we see around us, right? So this idea of contextuality, right, and this idea of space for what is not deterministic, both from an ontological perspective, right, in the case of Shunyata and in the case of Vedanta, as well as from an epistemological perspective, as in the case of Vyapti and how we define that, or Arthapatti for that matter. Arthapatti is actually the other way around. It's the contrast, where we are talking about something being assumed to be real before we use it for proving it in its entirety. These all give very tantalizing ways in which we can compare quantum logic and the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, and that can be put out there essentially as something we should kind of reflect upon, right? I mean, when we talk about the reality of the nature of the universe, what is deterministic, how do we get the knowledge of what is out there, is itself has many strands, many nuances to it, right? And I think all these traditions, somewhere or the other, are handling or addressing that, basically. Yes.
But the framework we are working on,
Yeah.
According to the Western philosophy, like they don't. The modern science is like that. They don't believe anything until you prove it
Yeah.
through any experiment or something, or
Right.
any
Yeah. With empiricism, yeah.
with
Empiricism, yeah. No, that is true. But I would ask you, how did we, as a in the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, say anything different, right? For instance, in the Rig Veda, I always say the Nasadya Sukta, right? When we talk about the last shlok, the last line of the Nasadya Sukta, it talks about a certain, what I see as a very agnostic thought, right? Where the deities may know the final reality, or maybe even they do not, right? And in Vedanta, I took Diksha in the Ramakrishna mission. I'm very closely associated with the Ramakrishna mission. And even in there, or in any other strand of Vedanta, we are not preached anything, right? We are never told that this is the way to access the reality, right? There are certain ways, practices, sadhana, or elements of sadhana, which can help us get there, right? But we are never told the form, right? Because actually, funnily, you cannot even speak about that form, right? When we talk about Brahman, we talk about it as something that cannot be articulated, something that does not have an attribute in the sense of how we talk about attributes around us of things, right? So even talking about it, right, is moot. It's not possible, right? So it is purely an experiential way of doing it, right? In science as well, till you have empirical verifiability, right, and you talk about falsifiability, right, that you can falsify or not falsify something, we do not accept that. We do not accept that, right? So Higgs boson, I always say, it was given in 1960s, right? The theory of it was given in 1960s. After the turn of the millennium, that's when we finally got, and even after that, like a full decade after that, right? That is when we got the sign of the Higgs boson. And that is when we actually accepted it to be a true part of nature, right? Before that, it was just a theory. Right? So this idea, I think we are very much in line with that. I mean, we have been. I mean, we came before all of this came, right? But this idea of agential realism, as I call it, right? The way we kind of experience it or have agency in it, right, is very, very important, I feel.
Okay. So, Dr. Mrittunjoy, my next question will be, you have written in your book, Shiva to Schrödinger, that non-commutativity plays an important role in both IKS, that is Indian knowledge system, and in modern science also. Can you tell us a little about this?
Absolutely. So non-commutativity is basically this idea that the sequence of how things happen actually matters, right? So in the context of quantum physics, we have this idea of non-commutativity of operators. Right? So when we talk about the momentum and position of a particle, we can define a non-commutative relation between them. Right? So now, when we talk about the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, I'll focus on Trika Shaiva Darshan, right? I mean, in Trika Shaiva Darshan or Kashmiri Shaivism, the way in which Spanda, the causation from Spanda or the causation from the interplay of Shiv Shakti, there are 36 tattvas that get created, right, in the process, right? And there is a non-trivial manner in which the way it happens, right, that sequence matters, right? The way the world emanates, the universe emanates in that manner, has a certain non-commutative aspect to it, right? So that is very, very important. And this layering or the sequentiality, rather, layering is not the right word, sequentiality is very, very important. Now, when we talk about Paninian grammar, right, when we talk about Sandhi, right, Sandhis and this idea of how we apply it in many different contexts, that also has many rules, very specific rules about the sequentiality, so to say, right? So for instance, the outcome differs from the reverse order or some other application in certain ways, right? And even sentence constructions or the way we develop the grammar and present it, right, has a very definite manner of non-commutativity that comes into the picture, right? In Navya Nyaya, when we talk about Anuman, right, when we are inferring something, right, it is almost Bayesian, right? Because you have to consider a lot of context, right? Especially when we talk about Gangesh Upadhyay ji or Raghunath Shiromani, right? From Mithila and from Bengal, Nabadvip, right? In Bengal, they talk about this quite a bit, right? They have qualified the Nyaya philosophy and looked at these aspects of contextuality, and I see the non-commutative aspect in that as well, right? So when we talk about Prakriti or Purush Prakriti or Brahman Maya, right, or the Nyaya Vaisheshik framework or Trika Shaiva Darshan, all of these places, the sequentiality and the memory aspect, right, how things evolve in the way they do, is very, very primary, right? And so is it primary in quantum physics and in many other streams of physics as well, right? So non-commutativity, I think, is one of the key areas, right, in my book as well I've addressed, which has not got as much of an attention as, let's say, interconnectedness has got or dualities have got as such. But I think the way we are, right, even in our own lives, right, we are what we are because of a very specific sequence of things, right? There is a very famous example of this grandfather paradox, not grandfather, yeah, the grandfather paradox, right, in physics, right? So let's say we were able to go back in time, right? And because of our actions, our grandfather, let's say, was affected some way, was influenced, such that they did not have the child they had, right? So how will you reconcile this idea, right? Because if the grandfather didn't have his child, then you were not born, right? And then you could not have gone back and done what you did. So he did have a child, but if he had a child, then you did go back again, right? So that's the paradox, right? Now, every step, right? We always talk about our ancestors, right? We in Hindu dharma, in Dharmic folds, we talk about the ancestor worship, right? And we have a certain kind of inheritance, right? Spiritual inheritance as well, which we get from that, and each of that matters, right? Even if you take one of that away, right, you would probably be very different from what you are, right? So this idea of memory, this idea of non-commutativity, it's a beautiful idea, right? And it's a reality of ours, right? So we should talk about it, we should kind of acknowledge it.
So it's not about everything about application. It's
right.
It's like other way around.
Exactly. And we have to, when we find our roots, right? One thing is I can, as a typical Vedantin, say that, well, we are Brahman. Right? We are Brahman and we realize that immediately, right? Mahavakya, right? Neti, neti, right? Nothing is, not this, not this. But that is not sufficient to go through the trajectory at times, right? Many people are not at that stage, right? So even in our Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, we don't say that one suit fits all. We don't say this thing will apply to everyone, right? We say that there are many different ways, right? You have to get rid of many of the things. In yoga, for instance, yam, niyam, right? Then you have many different other, aspects as well. And then you get to dharan, dhyan, samadhi, right? So some people can go directly to one of the levels. Others will have to go through the first few, right? And then you get there, right? So this whole way of how you have the samskaras from before, right? Karmic samskaras, how you get rid of that and how you move forward. I think that is very, very important.
Dr. Mrittunjoy, you already touched upon this one also, but I want you to explain a little bit more about the role of the observer in the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. How do insight from Indian knowledge systems help us rethink the role of observation in physical reality? And can we drive the primacy of the consciousness in quantum dynamics as well?
Right. So we have to be a little careful when we address this problem, because I mentioned about the witness in my very, I think, first or second response. The idea of the witness, or how the measurement happens, is very, very fundamental to quantum mechanics, right? But we have moved away from, let's say, in the 1920s, 30s and 40s, there were a lot of discussions on whether human consciousness, or consciousness in the sense of the observer, right, is that important, or can we have a state or a configuration where only the apparatus is enough, right? So now we have come to this point where there is a very well-known theory by the name of decoherence theory, right, which talks about how the system and the environment kind of correlates, and that could in principle get us to a kind of this measurement problem can be talked about in terms of that, right? However, having said that, I would say that we ourselves, right, one misconception we often have is that this idea of consciousness, right, this idea of chitta, chaitanya, we often talk about it in terms of the human-centered approach, right, which is what the West does, which is what we do in modern science, right, which is neuroscientific, which is based on the brain, right? But if you read about Vedanta, in Vedanta, for instance, and in many other traditions, the consciousness we're talking about there is not this consciousness, right? We are talking about something more universal, something more fundamental, actually, right? And we happen to be carriers of that consciousness, or part of that consciousness, but that consciousness is not coming from our brain per se, right? I mean, there are some schools that say that also, right, that there is no fundamental consciousness, so to say. So this whole debate, this whole discussion, right, of how we look at consciousness, how we look at how quantum physics brings in consciousness, one of the things I often ask is whether we are asking the right kind of questions or not, right? Whether when we say that the human consciousness, in the sense of human observers' consciousness, whether that defines it or not, is a point we should firstly address, right? I think we are not asking the right kind of question. We're not framing it in the right way, right? Because of both the sides, IKS also, and in the sense of quantum physics as well, right? Now, within IKS, there are aspects, for instance, in Trika Shaiva Darshan, right? We talk about pratyabhignya, right? This idea of recognition, right? So the idea is that we are not passive kind of players of this whole game, or you can call it this whole reality, so to say, right? And even within, for instance, when we talk about Utpal Dev and Abhinav Gupta, right, there are many aspects where the reality is participatory. It's a participatory reality, so to say, right? And so the idea of the observer is very, very important.
Can I say it, Maya?
Maya in what sense would you say? I mean,
we are all participating.
Yes. So, but we are participating as if from a projection, right? We are actually the same reality, so to say. In Kashmiri Shaiva Darshan, we talk about Shiva, Parama Shiva, right? And from Parama Shiva comes the 36 Tattva, and we are comprised of, or we are part of that greater scheme of things. That's what the Kashmiri Shaivite, philosopher would tell you. Now, in Yogacara Buddhism, right, there is something known as Vijñapti Matrata, right? Vijñapti Matrata means consciousness only. Right? So there also the idea is that there is only consciousness out there. Right? There's nothing other than consciousness. And this school of thought, right, if you talk about physics as such, the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation, which is what is the most preeminent when it comes to human consciousness and quantum physics, does have some, let's say, resonances with that, right? But the von Neumann-Wigner theory, right, is not the preeminent theory as it stands, right? We have, as I said, many other ways of looking at things, right? Now, when we talk about quantum mechanics, there is this aspect of relationality, right? Relational dynamics, right? And I think the idea of the role of the observer as an external observer and measurement, instead of that, if we can think of everything as being relationally, right, co-evolving, right? In that relationship, in the establishment of the relationship, if there is a co-evolution or the creation of the world as we see it, right? Maybe that is the way we should present it, right? Because then you are not making it human-centered, right? You don't need to, right? And that is exactly the point that we in Vedanta speak about. We say that, well, Western philosophers would say it's panpsychism. Panpsychism means everything has consciousness, right? But we are not saying that. We are saying that, but not the consciousness in the sense of the consciousness West is defining it as, right? We are saying there's an underlying layer or reality, so to say, right? Which is what is there even in the inanimate objects, so to say, right? Everything that we see around us, right? So the only thing that is important is how they are relating. Things are relating to each other, all right? So if you look at even a plant, right? There's an experiment we do in biology, right? You tilt that pot, right? And there is sunlight from somewhere. After a certain point in time, it will make its path such that it will reach the sun, right? In any other thing, in physical systems as well, right? It will move from, let's say, in osmotic systems, osmosis, right? From a higher concentration to a lower concentration, spontaneously, right? Now, whether you call it consciousness is obviously something we will not do as physicists, right?
We will have another episode about
we will talk about that as well, right? So now the thing is, in this case, this observer-dependent reality is something where in Vedanta we have something called as the Drishti Srishtivad, right? Drishti Srishtivad, which is basically the doctrine that your perception precedes creation, right? Perception precedes creation. And Sriharsha in the Khanda Khadya, he talks about this assumption of an independent objective reality, right? And he talks about the validity of pramana and how we construct these pramana, right? How we kind of infer things from this pramana, right? And so rather than saying that reality is indeterminate until that cognition happens, we talk about how certainty can have logical refutations, logical kind of, opposition, so to say. And there is a skeptical approach, so to say, of how we look at pramana and the creation of reality or the perception of reality itself, right? Similarly, in Nyaya, for instance, we talk about pramana and pramata and prameya, right? Even in that, the idea of the cognitive instrument, right? The agential aspect of that is spoken about when we define Nyaya epistemology, right? So I think the question, again, as I say, the way to kind of talk about it, number one, is to look at what is consciousness, which is the major question which everyone is trying to look at. But in that, I feel we are going with a very westernized approach, right? Where we are talking about, not westernized, that's a wrong word. I mean, I would say the modern neuroscientific approach, right? If we are wanting to stay to that, that's totally fine, right? But if we are wanting to go with what is Chit Chaitanya we call Satchitananda, right? That idea is not neuroscientific only, right? And it is not coming from the brain per se, right? Number one. Number two, quantum mechanics is also not talking about human consciousness anymore, right? At least the theories right now, right? So that needs to slightly change, right? And also this idea of relational co-evolution, right? This is, I think, the center point of where physics, quantum physics stands. And this is exactly what we talk about in, I was talking about Pratitya Samutpada, right? Which is in Buddhism. It talks about co-evolving reality, I mean, dependent origination, as it is called, right? So that is exactly what we are talking about as well, to a large extent, in many of the strands of Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, right? So
when you explain like that, it makes sense. Last question, Dr. Mrittunjoy. Despite its paradoxes,
yes,
there are many paradoxes.
yes.
Quantum mechanics remains an internally consistent framework. Can concept for Indian tradition help us frame a more holistic understanding of coherence in the universe?
Right. That's a very important question on multiple fronts, right? Coherence, this idea of coherence and how there is self-consistency, right? Both at the level of ontology and at the level of epistemology, right? Ontology, basically the coherence of things we see out there, which are, present, and there is a compatibility of these things, right? So for instance, when we talk about the forces of nature, right? The way they are defined in the case of weak interaction and electromagnetism, there is a certain aspect of symmetry breaking that happens, right? Spontaneous symmetry breaking that happens. I'll not go into that, that will become a physics lecture in itself. But the idea that they are coherent among themselves, right, is a very important part of physics, right? Now, in quantum physics itself, there are a number of different counterintuitive ideas, right? However, there is a certain internal, logical or theoretical coherence, essentially. And within quantum phenomena, there is this aspect of quantum coherence. Now, in the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, whether we have exactly spoken of coherence in the same way, at least to my knowledge, right? I wouldn't say we have defined it in that particular way, but we have different ways to speak about coherence or order, let's say, order of things, right? So one important aspect, of course, is rhythm, right? The idea of order, universal order. And there is apparent disorder at times, but there is an overarching order of sorts, right? There's a tendency of things to act or behave in certain ways, essentially, right? So there's a very interesting anecdote, right, which comes from the Puranic tales, right, which is on Vritra, right, which is he was a demon, right, who embodied chaos and disorder, essentially, and he was wreaking havoc, right, havoc. And then Indradev, he had to kind of come by and use his vajra and then quell him and then bring about the order again, right? And in fact, I think there was some aspect of the flow of the rivers were also stopped, right? And then he had to kind of break the dam or whatever, wherever he was. So the idea of spontaneity, right, of the fluidity of how nature is. There are times, as you were talking about chaos, right? There are times when things are very chaotic in the universe, right? But even in that chaos, there is a certain self-organization that comes in, right? For instance, when we talk about the Big Bang, right? In the very initial parts, there was a lot of gas, right? There was a lot of celestial material, right? The debris, the various kinds of materials. So from radiation, it went towards a certain direction. And then when the solar system was being formed, there was a swirling mass of things. And that slowly got more oriented, and now we see such a beautifully, precise way in which planets are oriented, and then, the satellites are oriented, and so on. So there is a very natural self-organizability, right? And there is a certain order of things, right? Which is with the forces in play, with the symmetries in play, and so on and so forth. There's another aspect which is very interesting, which is that of the stages of evolution, right? Both in terms of knowledge as well as in terms of reality, right? Reality of things. So there, again, I think the idea of context is very important, right? So for instance, there is in the solar system itself, right? Let's say, the planets, right? They have the Earth, for instance. There is this aspect of precession, right? And there was a talk I gave in Sangam, which was on Mahakumbh, right? So the idea of how we look at the constellations, right? If we don't account for that precession, right, we will be in a very different kind of state of what the quote-unquote zodiac in the astronomical sense means from what it means in the Indian context, where prakarana, which is basically the idea of precession, is accounted for, right? And therefore it is more aligned with the astronomical side of things, right? So context is very important when we are defining certain things, and context is also important when we talk about the stages of evolution, right? So for instance, when we talk about yug parivartan, there's a word that we use in our Bharati Gyan Parampara, and the yug dharm, right? Yug dharm, right? So there are many things, for instance, these days I see, right? People are judging things in the Itihasa, for instance, or our Puranic tales, or our Bharati Gyan Parampara from a very modern lens, right? From a very modern lens and in a very naive and simplistic way, right? But that is not correct, right? Because there are many norms. Let's not even go into more fundamental things, but there are many aspects of social dynamics, right? And way we orient things which are very different today as they were even, let's say, 10 or 15 years back, right? Forget about thousands of years back out there, right? So there is a code almost, right? It is a code of sorts.
Mistranslation also maybe.
Absolutely. There is, I would say there's deliberate mistranslation as well, right? So they don't want to kind of align with that, right? Now, in our universe, there were many different epochs. Epochs are stages of evolution, right? So there was an inflationary period. Inflationary period means, as a word, inflation is used in economics, right? So in this case, the universe was very rapidly expanding. Right? There was a small period of time, some seconds, not even seconds, a fraction of that, where there was a massive rapid evolution. Then there was a radiation dominated period where radiation was most important, and so on and so forth. Right? In each of these epochs, there were different kinds of physics, or you can call it the dynamics, right, which was preeminent, which was important, right? Even in society, we see that, right? When we were under the colonial yoke, so to say, right, for a long time, that led to a lot of transformations, right, both at the intellectual level, social level, which were not very good for us, right, in the long term of things. After independence, we have slowly started coming into our own, right? So the Yug Parivartan and the Atma Nirbharta, as Modi ji speaks about, is very, very important in the modern context, right? And the understanding of that, right? So the coherence, when we talk about, it's a contextual coherence, right? It is always defined in that way, right? We would not have been able to do a lot of things like today we have a Ministry of, in the Ministry of Education, we have an IKS division, right? Which is talking about so many important projects, right? At Sangam, we have had a number of different discussions, right? If it was even 75 or 80 years back, right? Or not even that, even the Nehruvian times, right? I mean, or post-Nehruvian times, immediately after, I think we would have been in a very different kind of, state, so to say, if we were to even think about doing something like that, right? So the coherence of thought here, right? And the coherence of narrative building, right? Is also contextual, of course, right? And it has to be calibrated in that way. It is an adaptive process, right? So in quantum physics also we see that there is a number of adaptive aspects and the coherence comes out in many different contexts, in optics, for instance, and so on and so forth. But again, I would, what I started off with, right? We have to be very careful where we are drawing metaphorical aspects, right? Where we are talking about metaphysics, even poetry at times, right, in the Puran, in the Itihas, for instance, and where we are talking about physics and the aspects of empiricism, right, which may have resonances, but they need not be connected blindly, is what I would like to put it as. And in doing that, as I always say, it's not that we are demeaning science as much as we are demeaning ourselves and our Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, right? Because we should not be seeking validation, right, of, I heard somebody speak about Tanmatras, right, the idea of subtle elements in the context of quantum field theory and string theory and so on and so forth. Now the point is, Tanmatras comes from a very fundamental space, right, of Prakriti, and then you kind of go forward in that way and so on and so forth. And string theory, sure, we are talking about fundamental fields and so on and so forth, but this correspondence is firstly not very well established, right? And just because string theory is an important or established theory, we need not get a certificate from that to talk about Tanmatras, right, is my point, right? So I think we need to stand for ourselves and rigorously pursue truth, right? It may be in metaphysical ways, it may be in philosophical ways, it may be in very hard science, as we call it, but it has to be done consistently, rigorously, and with integrity is the important point, right? So, yeah.
You mentioned many things like string theory.
Yes.
And I also thinking about coherence in terms of quarks.
Right.
Like we will have many episodes about that,
Yes,
hopefully,
yes, absolutely.
right?
Yes.
So, if I may say that this, Vedantic thought process, it's like a tool, like mathematics we use for physics. We can safely say that, right?
Yes, yes. I mean,
understand better.
Absolutely. Dharm is, I would say, at the utilitarian aspect of it, if you talk about dharmic modes of accessing reality, so to say, I like to put it that way, there are many different ways to do it, and there are certain strands which have been well defined, right? And you're supposed to, go align with your swadharma, right? Your own internal self, the dharma of the self, and then, optimally pursue what you have to get there, essentially, right? So any guru, for instance, the true maharshis and, the gurus that we have had in our traditions, they've always said the same thing, right? I mean, Ramakrishna Paramhams, for instance, he said this very well-known Bengali, phrase, right? Jato mot, tato poth. Right? As many mat means, thought or perspectives or ways to do things, those many paths, right? So just in that much, right? So that is the beauty of our parampara.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you so much.
Mrittunjoy.
Yeah.
And I will tell the viewers, please stay tuned for next episodes as well. Namaskar.